Sure.
Great. Okay, so we are broadcasting. And people are coming in. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to give some more people a couple seconds again to join in. So if you hold on for us for a couple of seconds, then we'll be able to start in a little bit. Okay, so I think we're good now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us again for part 2 of the second webinar topic in our Career Month series. Today, we are continuing from yesterday's topic, which is job search, hosted by Mr. Eric Schlesinger and Ms. Thelma Sequeira. We are happy to have them both here again today, continuing from the discussion yesterday. We had a very lively discussion and the questions were flowing. Please continue that momentum today. It was a very productive session, and let's try to keep that momentum going again. For those of you who know persons who would like to join in and have not been able to register on the Zoom, we are going live on Arthur Lockjaw Global School of Business's Facebook page. So you can join us and view on the ALJ GSB's Facebook page. And the videos are also available on the Facebook page after the event is done for your viewing. So today again, I'd like to introduce Ms. Thelma Sequeira, who is an HR business partner for IDB Invest. And she will be taking us through some of the opportunities available at the IDB and how we can access them. And she will then be followed by Mr. Eric Schlesinger, who will take us through, again, recapping some of the stuff we did yesterday, and then going forward and continuing with the teaching today. So I'll pass it on to Thelma, and we will see Eric in a little bit. Thelma?
Thank you, Reynardo. I appreciate it. Happy again to be here. Excited to be able to share with you. And just a quick recap. Yesterday we talked about a little bit about, you know, what the IDB group is. We're pretty much a development bank. We're the largest source of multilateral finance and technical assistance for Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're divided into 3 different, I would say, working areas or focus areas. One being the largest, the public sector side, which works directly with governments. The private sector side, which is IDB Invest, that's the group that I'm currently servicing. And they work directly with companies in order to, you know, help achieve the development goals of the different member countries. And last but not least, we have the smaller team or group, which is the one that is working much more on innovating, basically. So it's IDB Lab, and what it does is it works on trying to find innovative ways of achieving more inclusive growth. Now, moving into the area of opportunities, which was what interests me most in this, you know, in this conversation we're having. We have a web page available for you to look at, and I highly recommend that you do. That is literally the place where we are publishing and sharing all the different opportunities we have available, which are basically, they're based on different needs, structures, times, and I would divide them into 3 different areas. One being what we call the internships. They are shorter term, 2 to 3 months. We have decided to evolve based on the current situation we're currently in globally. We're now working on offering virtual internships, and that'll give you an opportunity to get to know briefly the organization and what we do. Then we have non-structural opportunities. In other words, short-term, but longer than internships. Usually they're the complementary workforce, CWs, and those can range from everything from a month to up to 3 years. And there's different type of modalities within that big umbrella of complementary workforce. We have, for example, PECs, which are product-based consultancies. They're more independent. You're not necessarily working in the country office with the rest of the IDB colleagues, but it also allows you to be able to work in different assignments at the same time with different organizations. And last but not least, we also have staff positions, which are more structural in nature, and they're based on an initial 3-year contract, fixed term contract, which can be extended based on business need as well as performance. And we have opportunities all throughout the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as in headquarters, which is Washington, DC. Thank you very much. And I want to pass the word to Eric now. Thank you.
Thelma, thank you very much for continuing our conversations here and allowing us to reflect back on the topics that were part of our conversation yesterday. What I'd like to do now is I'm pulling up our slides here. Okay, so a quick review from what we did yesterday, but before I do so, I have an assignment I'd like to ask all of you to do. It's a very simple assignment. That assignment is, I want you to write down the names of 5 people that you know. Write down the names of 5 people that you know. Now, if you're going to ask me, is that 5 people who are in your area of interest? The question is, write down the names of 5 people that you know. If you're going to ask me, is that the names of 5 people who are in your country? Write down the names of 5 people that you know. So just write down the names of 5 people that you know. And as you're doing so, I just want to give you a quick review of what we talked about yesterday. We started off talking about myths and facts of the job market. We reintroduced to you the career development methodology of self-assessment and exploration, decision-making. Are you properly prepared? And then the action orientation. We focused on targeting and how to do that, reminding you that what are the problems that you can solve, because that's what employers are looking for, individuals who can solve problems. We also shared with you the bullseye and recognizing that there is really not the perfect job, and also there's usually not the perfect candidate. And we concluded by talking about different approaches of the job search, informed by some of the responses that you gave to us yesterday of how candidates look for jobs, and I countered with that in terms of how employers look for candidates. So today, we're going to continue on with that, and since you've now completed your list of the names of the 5 people whom you know, I would now like you to use either the chat or the Q&A to please tell us, not the names, not of interest to us, but identify the relationship that you have between yourself and one of those people on the list. So identify the relationship that you have between yourself and one of the persons on the list. And while you're doing that in the Q&A or the chat function, we're going to talk about that in a few quick moments. I just want to remind you again, when we were talking about the ways that candidates look for jobs, the way employers look for candidates, there is the idea of the job postings, the mass mailings of resumes, using resources like Monster.com, LinkedIn to post your own resume, etc. But we countered that with the ways that employers look for candidates, in terms of hiring the known or seeking referrals from people that work for them of who others that they might know about. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is ask Reynardo if you'd be kind enough, please, to read off some of those relationships that people have written in terms of their connection between themselves and one of the 5 people that they know that they wrote down. Reynardo?
Yeah, so we have, thus far, we have faculty at Arthur Lockjack, GSB. We have classmates, we have family, a pastor, a friend, a mentor, a past work colleague, and my boss.
Okay. So that's a great start. I'm sure the other people will continue to write in, but we're gonna move on with that, because what you have done, Reynardo, is in reciting those items, and more importantly, what people have done when they've written in, is talk about this concept of networking. And let's talk about networking, because it begins with you. And the idea of networking is something that many people are uncomfortable with, because I think they have the wrong understanding of what networking is and what it means and how to do it. I think that many people think about networking as picking up a telephone, calling up somebody who they don't know, and trying to hit that person up for a job. That's not networking. In fact, that somewhat resembles what I would call telephone sales solicitations that I'm sure you also, as I do, get unfortunately at dinner time almost every evening when people are trying to sell you something on the phone. That's not networking. That's telephone sales solicitation. So what is networking? Networking really means to extend and to expand the network that you already have. And by asking you that very simple question at the beginning, write down the names of 5 people you know, you are identifying 5 persons in your network. Now, my assumption is that none of you had any difficulty in writing down the names of 5 people. In fact, if I had not been talking at the same time, if I had given you some quiet time to do that, if I had said, write down the names of all the people you know, your list would of course been longer than 5. Maybe 15, maybe 50, maybe who knows how many. That is your network. You already have a network. These are the people that you already know and that you're connected to. And then when we asked you to identify not the name, but the connection, the relationship between you and these persons, you started to identify what I call the 4 F's. Family, friends, faculty, former or present employers. These are the people with whom you are already linked. This is your network. It already exists. You have been spending your life to this point in time creating your network. And you are growing your network with every continuous conversation, with every continuous interaction that you have with other people. You have a network. So when we talk about expanding that network, what do we mean by that? So let's look at each of these 4 elements individually. So if we look at the family network, and as that starts to open up, you see that there are other individuals that your family members can connect you to. That's a pretty easy one to understand. And if we look at faculty, your connections through the university, through the business school, the individuals that they can connect you to, as well as your fellow students that you have studied with, and they are perhaps part of your friends group, your classmates and others. And how can they connect you to others? And lastly, we say former or present employers. And who are the individuals that they can connect you with? This is your network. Again, you in the middle, in the blue color, the orange-like circles or ellipses, the network that you already have. And how do you extend that network beyond from that? So we're going to talk about that in a moment, but I'd like to share with you an example, a story. The story happened to me many years ago when I was the director of the Career Service Office at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And I was quite young at the time, and I was somewhat full of myself. And I remember a older graduate student coming into my office, introducing herself as a person who's getting a master's degree in biomedical research and seeking the help of myself and the office to find job opportunities. And she identified that she was interested in the Washington, D.C. area because she had a family here, and therefore she needed to stay in the Washington metropolitan area. So being young and brash, I asked her, so, what have you been looking at? Where would you like to be? And she responded that, well, of course, everyone's ideal for biomedical research in the Washington metropolitan area is a government agency called the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health, which is the US government's research arm in the health field. And so then I said to her, so tell me, who do you know there? And I thought it was a reasonably simple question. I was trying to help her identify the network that she had. But what happened next really caught me completely off guard. In fact, it actually scared me, because as she sat across my desk from me, I noticed that she was having a physiological reaction to that question. What I mean by that physiological reaction is that her neck got very red, and that rash, so to speak, extended up into her face. And I was getting very concerned. I didn't know what was going to happen. And so I saw her nervousness building. And I said, all right, let me change the conversation. I said it to myself in my mind. I said, okay, why don't we switch off here? Let me think about some other questions I can ask you. I said, so tell me, what do you do in your spare time? And then her body kind of relaxed. And she said, oh, I like to play bridge, a card game. You may be familiar with it. And I said, oh, that's nice. I said, I played bridge. My parents taught me how to play bridge with my brother, and we used to play as a family. It's very nice. And then, who do you play bridge with? And here is the direct quote that she spoke. And I'm giving you this because, again, this only happened about 35 years ago, but I still remember the quote. She said, oh, I play bridge with women in my neighborhood. Oh my gosh. And I was startled by that. And I said, what happened? What's going on? What is it? And she said, I just realized that one of the women I play bridge with, one of my neighbors, her husband works at NIH. Now, I keep that story in my mind, and I'm telling you that story today because it is a reflection of this notion of who do we know? That when I asked her that question directly, do you know anybody at NIH, it gave her this physiological reaction, a nervous reaction to it. But when I asked her, in essence, write down the names of 5 people you know, she had no difficulty in identifying her bridge partners and then recognizing that one of them could connect her to somebody at NIH. So that's why we started with this exercise today. The notion of networking, to understand it, means to build upon your network. Okay, so what do you do with this then? How do you operate with this? What's the next step for you to do? So what I'm going to share now is a slide we used last week when we talked about collecting information in the work world. Now we're going to talk about it in terms of networking. And so again, it's what do? You want to ask for information. It's not about asking for a job. How do you do it? And again, we're going to set you up with this model. And I want to focus our attention on this thing called the informational interview. So for those of you who were tuned in last week to us, this is going to be a reminder for you. For those of you who were not able to tune in last week, this is going to be new information for you. So what is an informational interview? It is just as its name suggests. The purpose to learn, to gain knowledge, to understand. You are conducting an interview much like a journalist would do to collect background information for a story. And who might you address that informational interview to? To anyone who is doing something that you would like to be doing, hence in your career environment. And we list here some of the questions that you might ask. But again, for those of you who were connected last week, remember that I said to you that for some people, this is a little bit daunting to start calling up people. I'm not sure how I'll do it. I don't think I'm comfortable with this yet. What do I do? I said, and we introduced to you that we call the pleasure practice. And the pleasure practice really means, how do you practice this? How do you practice the exercise of conducting the informational interview? And so we encourage you to do this, and I use the emphasis pleasure, that do it with people who share an interest with you. Because you want to have a conversation that's going to extend beyond one or two questions so that you can test out this notion and build your skills of asking questions, getting answers, and recognizing how some of the questions you might ask might be beneficial of the answers that you get, and other questions that you might ask maybe just were not phrased correctly and therefore did not give you meaningful information. So doing these practices, and I use it in plural because it may be more than one, doing these practices will give you the opportunity to test it out, and as you test it out, it's to build your skill. But the last column I want to share with you also, just because the word interview is used both in the informational interview and the job interview, an informational interview is not a job interview. We all understand what a job interview is as defined there. So what goes on in an informational interview? Even before that, how do we do it? How do we go about doing it? So again, I want you to imagine a situation. I want you to imagine a situation that your phone rings and you answer it, and here's what is being spoken to you over the phone from the other end. I'm going to say the following. Hi, my name's Eric Schlesinger. You don't know me, but can I spend some time with you to learn more about you and what you do? Now, if you are a normal and natural human being, your reaction to that is probably going to be to hang up the telephone. Why would you spend time with somebody who you don't know? And why would you be interested to share information about yourself with somebody who you don't know? It makes no sense. Now, there are probably some very polite people in our audience today who may be kind enough to listen a little bit longer, but generally I would imagine that most people would not. That's not an informational interview. That's a cold call. There's no connection. And even if I didn't say, hi, my name's Eric Schlesinger, you don't know me, even if I didn't say that you don't know me, you're still not going to know who's Eric Schlesinger. And you might ask, do I know you? But the way to establish an informational interview is using your network. Again, the network that you already have. So as you have been talking to people in your network and you've been asking them about other people that they might know, and they offer you a name, and then you ask them, oh, can I talk to that other person? Can I use your name so that when the telephone rings again, or this time, the conversation may go something like this. Hi, I'm Eric Schlesinger. We have a mutual friend. John Smith suggested that you'd be an excellent person for me to talk with because he said that you are really knowledgeable and you might have some time to share some of your ideas with me. Might that be possible? And so now we don't have a cold call. We have what might be called a warm call because the mutual friend, John Smith, that name that rings a bell with you, makes you more open to the possibility of that conversation with me. And so you're doing the same thing, calling up somebody whose name you've been given by somebody else with whom you've already conferred, and they've said, feel free to use my name. And so you're now going to do so to introduce yourself to that other person. And then to establish an opportunity for contact. And today in our virtual world, it may not be to grab a coffee someplace, but maybe can we schedule a time when I can call you back and I may be able to spend 15 or 20 minutes with you on the phone? Or the person might say, oh, no, right now is very convenient. Let's just talk right now. So you need to be prepared for that. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But the idea of this informational interview, and again, let's focus on the top line in the slide, what to do. It's to ask for information, for insights, for ideas, referrals, suggestions. This is your focus. And I'll tell you that the second line, we say, do not ask for a job. And we say that very purposefully. Because if your conversation, no matter how it begins, but ends with, do you have a job for me? The conversation will probably end right then and there. And no further information will be shared with you. That's not to your advantage. So people say though, but wait a minute, if I'm looking for a job, how can I say I'm not looking for a job? And my response to you is a very simple one. And that is that you have to believe in yourself right now, that your goal in this networking is to meet people, to gain knowledge and information, to gain insights that can help you in your decision process, and that might lead you to opportunities. But certainly, if you're going to ask a question as direct as, do you have a job for me? I would not encourage you to ask the question that way. Because you've put that person on the spot. And their answer is usually a binary, it's either a yes or no, and the larger possibility is going to be no. But perhaps, either in a first conversation or even in a follow-up conversation, you might be able to ask the question of, wow, this has been interesting information you've shared with me. I've thought about it. And I'm curious, might you know of opportunities that could exist or that exist out there that may be aligned with my interests and where I can be of value to the employer? And you see from the way you've asked that question, it's not, do you have a job? It's, do you know of jobs? So it's possible that person can respond, oh, by the way, I have a job right here. But it's not limited to that. But again, I want to emphasize the real importance of this is the gaining of knowledge and information. Because as you are progressing through this networking process, as you are picking up information from each of the individuals with whom you're talking, you are learning more about your career field. You are arming yourself with more and more information that's going to make you a better and better candidate, that's going to help you better understand how you can be the problem solver. Let me move on. How do you want to prepare to network? So the first line here is critically important, because when you make that first conversation with a person and you start by asking them questions, they might say back to you, you know, before I answer your questions, why don't you tell me a little about yourself? And this is where your 30-second resume, or some people call it your verbal resume, other people call it the elevator speech or the elevator pitch, comes in. And what we mean by that is this is a very short statement. This is kind of your brand statement of who you are, but it gives background, gives understanding to the person you're talking to. That part of your preparation is to be thinking about what are the questions you want to be asking, and what's the information you want to communicate even about yourself that you want to include into the conversation. That the best kind of networking is a give and take. So far we've only been talking about taking. That is, you're asking questions, that you're taking knowledge and information from the individual. What do I mean by giving? Well, giving means being prepared to offer. I've had this happen when people have done informational interviews with me, when we're talking about a particular topic, and I say something about maybe a project I'm involved in, and the person chatting with me says, wow, that's interesting. Did you see the recent article in the journal about that? Did you see that article posted online about that? Did you happen to read that blog about that topic? And if I say no, they say, oh, well, can I forward it on to you? There are many ways that can be included in giving. Maybe a person can say, well, it's interesting you talk about that. You know, I just finished my research project as a student at Lockjack, and here's some things that I found about that. Or if you're out in the workplace and somebody says something to you, you say, geez, that's interesting. You know, in my organization, we're doing similar kind of work, but we're doing it in this fashion. So give and take makes the networking more valuable. Record keeping is quite simple. You ought to keep record of who you're talking to and what you learned from them and who referred you to that person. And if that person gives you other names of referral, that you should keep notes of that as well. Why? Because if you're talking to person number one and they give you 2 or 3 other names to talk to, and you have conversations with those other individuals, it will make perfect sense for you. And I'd strongly encourage you to write back to person number one and say, just want to report to you the names you gave me, numbers 2 and number 3. I called up those individuals. They were very kind to me. They shared knowledge and information with me. I really appreciate the time and the names that you gave to me. And what that's going to do is 2 things. Number one, you're reinforcing in that person the value of them spending time with you to begin with. But number 2, you're demonstrating that you are a serious person in this networking concept. And you are reinforcing with them, and perhaps they'll even offer to you other names. Let me give you another example here, and that is that right now I'm helping the son of an employee colleague of mine who's just graduating from university, looking for opportunities in a particular area that I really don't know anything about. But it turns out that I know a friend of mine who has had tangential activity in that career field. And I contacted my friend and said, would you be willing to talk to somebody? And she said, sure. And then so I put her in touch with the son of my colleague. And the 2 of them have had a number of phone conversations. She has given to him some other names, and he very smartly has kept in touch with her to inform her of what has happened in those other conversations. And both he and she, my friend, have then come back to inform me that he's gotten other names from her, that she is giving him additional names to be more valuable. And to practice this process, so what do I mean by the practice of this? It means that although many times we can schedule an informational interview, we can be prepared for it. You know, if you're going to call somebody up, you can be prepared for that conversation. But there are situations that may just come about that you aren't scheduling, they just come up. And how do you deal with that? So I'd like to share with you 2 or 3 examples of different situations. These examples are from the book that I wrote a number of years ago, E-Job Hunting, Planning Your Career and Searching for Jobs Online. We talk about these various situations in making contact. So let me give you the first one. A friend arranges a meeting between you and his boss who works in your field of interest. You arrive in her office, that is the boss's office, and after some initial conversation, she says, so tell me, what are you interested in? And you respond. Your response is going to be that 30-second resume, your elevator pitch, your brand statement. You need to be prepared for that. So even though you think you're going out to conduct an interview with somebody else, you better be prepared to answer some questions also. Another example. You attend a meeting of a local chapter of a professional association. You are told that the first half hour will be devoted to networking. As you arrive, people are talking in small groups. You walk up to one of those groups and you introduce yourself. And then you're asked, what do you do? And you respond. Okay, now that's an example of something that's obviously not happening in our lockdown mode right now of everyone being at home. But again, something to consider. So those are prepared environments, scheduled, you know they're going to happen. But let me share with you perhaps that non-prepared circumstance. You're at a social event, you're introduced to somebody who works for an organization you have targeted in your job search, and you say to this person, you were not planning that, you did not accept that invitation for that picnic, even in a large public space where people are social distance from each other, or after the pandemic when people might be together in smaller groups. But you're not going to that dinner party, that social event, whatever it is, for the purpose of networking, but you need to be prepared for it because you never know who you're going to run into. I'll give you one more example. This happened a number of months ago here in Washington, D.C. When we were all still working from our offices. I was taking the subway home one evening, the mass transit subway here in Washington. And as I sat in the car opposite 2 young people, a boy and a girl, I kind of was listening on their conversation because I kind of do that. It's of interest to me. And these two people, it became clear to me, did not know each other. They were both professionally dressed. And what I came to gather from their conversations is one of them just entered into the car a stop or two before I did, sat down and started chatting with the other person. And their conversation rolled into, what do you do and where do you do it? The usual conversations that people have when they meet up with another person with whom they don't know. And as one of them got up because their station was coming ahead, asking back to the other, do you have a business card that I could have so I can continue our conversation later on? Again, that was not a planned networking environment. It just happened. And it happened that the individual was taking advantage of that moment. And so this notion about preparing to network is important. And here again, I want to present to you the word networking to emphasize the word E, and a very similar words, not working. In fact, the exact same words with only one letter difference, the E and the O. That networking really represents the most efficient and effective way of the job search. Again, as we said yesterday, not at the exclusion of other methodologies, but certainly this is going to be, as I've found for myself, as I found for my clients who I coach, and as I find in my reading in my literature, this is the most effective way in the job search campaign. And by the way, here's just some other questions that you can ask in terms of this informational interview. I want to focus on the first one. What kinds of problems do you face? Here, the individual is gearing in, is focusing in on that theme that we talked about yesterday, that theme of what are the problems that the employer has? Can you solve them? Are you the problem solver? So you have to understand what are the issues and the problems that people are facing, and then to determine, can you be involved in them? So this notion of networking as a main approach in the job search, I really want to leave with you that today. But I want to continue on with a few other topics. I want to talk a little bit about social media. Obviously, this is somewhat new. It didn't exist decades ago. It certainly is very present today. And so some thoughts about this. So when we think about social media and what platforms we use, I'm going to focus primarily on LinkedIn, which is by its definition and its advertising, the professional network connecting people, or maybe it's the network connecting professional people. Some theme like that they sell, so to speak. And for those of you who have a presence on LinkedIn or who have seen a LinkedIn, you'll notice that these are the elements of a profile. But I want to share with you some information that you may not be aware of. For instance, LinkedIn has a usability laboratory at their headquarters where they can bring people in, and in a laboratory environment where people are looking at a computer screen, but it's really a two-way mirror because behind it there's a camera, that LinkedIn can trace the eyeball movements of these subjects. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to find out where subjects looked first and what was the progression as they looked at a LinkedIn profile. And obviously, the conclusion is the first thing people look at is the photograph. And so here we offer to you, is it professional, friendly, enthusiastic? Does it emphasize your face? When we talk about a profile photograph on LinkedIn, we're talking about what some people call a headshot. A headshot meaning kind of from the shoulders upward, so that the head, the face, is in large part on the screen. There's no reason to show the rest of the body. Certainly there's no reason to show a lot of background, because the more background you're showing, the less significant the face is, and you want to have that friendly facial expression. The headline, which is the words that are associated right next to your name, does not have to be a job title, as some people mistakenly think. It really represents your byline. Who are you? What you are about. Your brand statement, which then comes next, that kind of paragraph information, and recognize that there are actually two parts of your brand statement. There is the first part that opens up automatically when the profile is shown, and then there's a second part, if it goes longer, that a person has to click on to extend into. So you have to make certain that the first part really contains the best information, because otherwise people aren't going to click further. And that in your brand statement, that you are using keywords that have been informed through your research. What are the words of your profession? You want to make certain that you are including those, because as happens, that employers, as we said earlier on, some employers who can access LinkedIn through an employer portal, and for a fee, they can do online searching of individuals by keywords. And so therefore, you want to make certain that your keywords are the appropriate ones. But also in your profile to show affiliations. These are the connections that you have with others. This is an important element. So here I want to focus once more on LinkedIn, because for me, Facebook, Twitter, those are nice social media environments, but those are not the professional environments. Let's focus on the LinkedIn. Also, part of that social networking is the groups or communities that you join, because it shows that you are an active member of your professional or career area, that you are making posts or blogs referencing or linking to other articles. And through that, you are showing, again, your professionalism. But this last statement, I think, really represents an issue that I've seen many people faced with, which is it's not so much a lack of social networking sites, the opportunities, but rather it's almost too much of that aimless business. How can we be using this for value? So for instance, if you have been given a name of a person by a colleague or friend, you can do a LinkedIn search for them to learn some background about that individual. All right. But one other piece to mention here about social media presence is recognize your own presence on social media. Because everywhere that your name is can be searched through by an employer. And there are a number of employers today, and the number is growing, who do part of their referencing or background checks on individuals to check social media presence. And so you need to be aware of that. And for instance, my professional association did a study a couple of years ago now. It was a 2-question study. It was asked of members of the association who are employers or recruiters. It said, question number 1, do you use social media as part of your evaluation of candidates? If yes, question number 2, have you ever not made an offer because of social media presence? And the response was rather interesting. 50%, 50, 1/2 of the respondents who said yes, they do use social media for background checks, 1/2 of those said that they have then not made an offer to somebody because of that person's presence in social media, meaning what they have said, what they have written about, what is out there about them. So be aware of your footprint, as it's known, in the world, the social media world. I just want to wrap up with 2 quick thoughts. We want to talk, just to remind you that resumes is part of job search. And so for resumes, we talk about a resume really as a word picture of you that defines your background as it relates to your goal. It's not everything about your past, but that which relates to your goal. And if you happen to have more than one goal, you're going to probably have more than one resume. So with that as kind of a background idea about resumes, just to give you that as an input. And of course, the next step after resumes is the interview, and to recognize that there are different types of interviews, as we represent here, one-to-one or panel interviews, assessment centers, etc. And there are different styles of questions that may be asked in interviews. Right? You need to be prepared to respond to these different kinds of questions. But I'd like to conclude by looking at these 4 evaluation factors. These are the evaluation factors that, number 1, employers are going to look at and use to evaluate you, but that you should also be using to evaluate them and this opportunity. So let's go through them and to understand them. The first factor is the can-do. That is, do you have the technical, functional, intellectual ability to do the job? So they're looking at you to say, yeah, can you perform it? And you want to be looking at it and say, do I have what it takes? Is this a job that I can do? The second is the will do. That is, do you have the interest, commitment? Some people use the word passion to do the job. So again, the employer is going to use different opportunities to gain this knowledge about you. It may be from the interview and to see your enthusiasm in the interview. But you need to be readying it for yourself, which is this really what I want to be doing? Am I going to be happy here? Right? Well, I want to do this work. The third factor we call the fit factor. And meaning, you have the characteristics that fit into the organization. So what we mean by this is the environment of the organization an environment in which you're going to see a good fit. So for instance, if you have learned that this is an employing organization or a unit within the organization that places a high commodity, a high value commodity on teamwork, working together collaboratively, but your style is you prefer to work by yourself. You're kind of a lone person, you do best in that environment. That's where you have succeeded in the past. Is that then going to be the right place for you to be, where you're not going to be able to call upon those personal characteristics and those strengths? And lastly is the reality test, meaning do your expectations approximate what is the reality of this organization? So for this one, I use the easiest example that comes to my mind. When in an interview, for instance, you may be asked the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And so if you think that the right way to respond to that question is with a job title, it's not necessarily the only way to respond to it, but if you think that's the way to respond to it, is the job title that you come up with one that fits into the modality of this organization? So here's what I do when I use this question in the environment of the IDV group. I say to people when I do training there, you know, what are your expectations? Where do you want to be 5 years from now? And I tell people that if your answer is to become a vice president, I remind them, you know, there are only 4 vice presidents in the IDB group, and so likely that you would be one of them in 5 years, that's not too likely. But I offer it to them as an alternative environment. I say, if you are applying for a job also in a bank, but not the Inter-American Development Bank, but in a commercial bank, as a professional position there, if you were to answer other than, I want to be a vice president in 5 years, they would look at you questionably, what's wrong with you? Because in a commercial bank, it's very likely that professionals are hired in, and after a few days or months, you become an assistant vice president, and you should be an officer of that bank within a 5-year period of time where there is something wrong. So these 4 factors, can do, will do, fit factor, and reality test, are part of the elements that employers are going to use to evaluate you, and you should be using to evaluate employers. So I'm going to stop there, and Renard, I'm going to turn it over to you, and hope that individuals have questions they might have submitted already or will be able to do so. That might be directed either to Thelma or to myself.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Eric. I think you've given us quite a lot to think about there now. So everyone, we're now open for questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to put it into the chat or the Q&A, and we will be able to raise it with Eric and with Thelma, and they'll be able to answer your questions. Wow, people are a little bit quiet today.
Well, let me start with an answer to a question that may not be asked yet, but is often asked. And that is, what length of time should I give myself in the job search campaign? And here's a kind of a rule of thumb, because there is no specific and exact answer. We don't know if it's going to take you 1 week or 1 year. 1 week or 1 month or 2 months or 1 year, whatever. But a rule of thumb that's frequently used, at least here in the United States, is to suggest the following. For every $10,000 of salary that you're hoping to acquire through this new job, give yourself 1 more month. Meaning that if the job you're seeking is a job that pays, let's say, $60,000, and again, I'm using US dollars, that you should consider a job search campaign might be 6 months in length. But if you are seeking a job that's $100,000 or more, that would be 10 months or longer.
Right.
And so the notion of, well, I'll wait until my job ends, or I'll wait until my contract ends to start looking for my next job, that's really not a very efficient methodology, because you may find yourself without employment in a transitionary time.
Someone just brought to my attention, Eric, you didn't answer the question from yesterday, which was, if we don't know anyone in the IDB to network with, how would we find someone?
Okay, I was thinking that someone's going to bring that back up again, so thank you for doing so. But if you go back to our initial question, write down names of 5 people that you know. And for instance, my assumption is that everybody connected on this phone, on this webinar this afternoon knows you, Armando, right?
Right, yeah.
And if they were to ask you, so I'm really interested in the IDB, who do you know that might know people there, or do you know people there? And the answer is, yeah, I think you do know some people there.
I think you just gave me a barrage of emails, Eric.
Well, sorry about that. But
Fine.
let's be realistic about this, which is that what you want to do is use your strongest connectivities.
Right.
So you may know somebody, for instance, who works at the World Bank. And through that person, you may get to know people who are working at the IDB. You may know somebody who works in the government in Trinidad and Tobago. They may know somebody who works at the IDB, or they may know somebody who knows somebody who connects up with it. So it's to use the network that you already have. That's the important response.
Great. So we have 3 questions lined up here now. I'll start with one that's on networking, as we're on that. How can networking and having a conversation with someone from the IDB help us with a specific position that we're applying to? Can they refer or recommend you internally to HR? Or what do you suggest specifically for the IDB? I think
I'm going to start off by having Thelma respond on the referraling process, and I'll pick it up after that.
Thelma?
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. No, in general terms, I would say if you have a conversation with somebody, and I agree with you, Eric, that the conversation has to be not necessarily or not directly about I need a job or I want a job in the IDB. Is how can you present yourself in such a way as, or to send the message that you can bring value to the organization, right? That in hiring you, be it through a consultancy or through a staff position, this is going to be a win-win for both the organization and for you. And in as much as you can do that, I think you can have the possibility of opening up the channel so that internal people can either direct you directly to HR or direct you to people who are working in a particular area and who might be looking for opportunities in the area where you have an interest.
Right. So let me pick up on that just to continue along. And that is to say that, again, the value of the informational interview is to gain knowledge and learning and information. And so that if you are networking with somebody within the IDB and there turns out to be a position that is opening, right now the knowledge you have of that position is based solely on what is described in the job posting, the job listing. but in having a conversation with somebody in the IDB who is familiar with or knows about that opportunity or that unit or that part of the organization, they can share with you information that may not be part of the job description, and or at least tell you what's the most important elements of the job description, so that you in your presentation, formally through your application, can be highlighting that background of your greatest value. Again, what's the problem that an employer is trying to solve? How can you present yourself as the problem solution?
Right. So we have a few more. Given the new normal in the COVID-19 world, where there will be fewer face-to-face gatherings, how does one adapt to this new environment from a networking standpoint?
You know, I think that's a very realistic question to ask given current circumstances. But for at least from my perspective, there is not a whole lot less interaction and networking going on now. People are using Zoom, or they're using other platforms to interact. People are spending more time emailing to friends or connecting with friends that way. I think the individual has to be contemplating what's the creative methodologies that are available to me, because there really are a lot of methods available to me that I need to utilize and I should be utilizing. So please don't hang your head down and say, well, I can't meet people for coffee, therefore I can't be doing this. There are so many other ways to be having interactions with people that I think you need to be stressing for yourself. What are those ways and how can I utilize it for my benefit?
Yes, and I would like to also plug for the Lockjack GSB alumni. We do have a networking platform that is supported by 10,000 copies, where you can network online with the other members of the Lockjack GSB community, whether it be students or alumni or faculty. Let's move along. And this is an interesting one from Kamal. Would there be an advantage to name drop in a conversation to see which name gets the biggest response?
That's a really interesting question. Again, Thelma, I'm going to turn to you first because you've been part of interview panels at the bank. Have you observed that, and what's your reaction to it? And then I'll give some other comments.
I would say in general, name dropping is not necessarily advantageous. It is a point of reference that can be used, but I would say, going back to the answer I gave before and the answer that you gave, I think the most important thing is not only be able to present yourself in such a way as, to convince that you are an asset, that you have a genuine interest, but I think the more research you can do, the more you can learn about the organization. I think that gives you a stronger competitive advantage when you are in an interviewing process. And it's something that I do have to say, as a recruiter and somebody who's in the panels, we do immensely appreciate knowing that people have had enough of an interest in the organization that they've done research, that they can share with us, what they've learned from that, from reading the webpage, from trying to understand, what our numbers are, where we're focusing, what's your strategy about. So I would say those are definitely areas where I would focus more than on the name dropping necessarily.
Right.
Yeah, let me just continue on that. I would say generally, the dropping of names just for the value of, this is a high-ranking individual, it can easily backfire unless there is a real connection between you and that individual. I've done training for interviewers in organizations, and that actually is one of the cases that I present to them. What's your reaction to this if a candidate does this? And most of the interviewers in that training are not at all impressed with that. What they would rather see is a person who has done, as Thelma said, a person who's done their research. In fact, there are some interviewers who actually ask that question: what did you do to prepare for this interview? And they are expecting to have some real serious responses to that. For an individual to say, well, I read the first page of I read the home page of your website, that's enough for, let's say, a high school senior to do. That's certainly insufficient for a professional to do in terms of their own research.
Right. And on the topic of interviews, is it a good idea to ask about salary or compensation in an interview?
That's an easy question to answer, and my response is no. Thelma, you may have some other reactions to it, but
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Okay, I always tell people that you are an absolute no leveraged advantage in the interview to be talking about that. And you are only demonstrating your need for security by asking questions like that. You want to wait to the moment in the process when you have leveraged advantage. And that is perhaps when the job is offered to you. Because then the organization has made a commitment that they're interested in you. And then to negotiate salary makes sense, because for a few extra dollars, it may be well worth the organization to come up with that money to support you, rather than to begin the job, the candidate selection or search and selection process all over again. So I would absolutely discourage you from asking that question. And more specifically, I would discourage you from answering that question. So that in an interview, if you are asked the question, what are you looking for in terms of salary? My advice to you is try to avoid responding to that question. That avoidance response could be something like, no, I'm sure your salaries are very competitive. I'd rather know more about the position. But if you are forced into that area, then I would strongly encourage you, number one, to have done your research so you have a pretty good idea of this range of salaries for positions like that in that kind of an organization, in that geography, but never give a single number. You're always giving a range that gives you opportunity. But Thelma, you have much more to say, I'm sure.
Yeah, we never talk about salaries during an interview process. HR is responsible for negotiating salaries. We might have conversations with particular candidates prior to the panel interview when we we have identified through technical screening, we have identified a couple of very strong candidates, and we do want to make sure that they go through the interview process only if both sides have as much an interest, right? So people might be really out of our range in terms of what we can pay them salary-wise. So we might have a conversation with them prior and try to understand what their general compensation expectations are. But usually it's something that we don't share during the panel interviews, and it's an offline conversation between HR. And usually, as Eric said, once you have been selected as the winning candidate.
So Sasha, actually, who is one of our organizational consultants at Lockjack GFD, raised an interesting point, which is employers actually a lot of times ask this question in the form, the initial questionnaire that you fill out upon entry into the interview. Is it safe to put in a figure at that point?
I would say, just to second what Thelma had said, the issue that an employer is looking at is to understand are we competitive with this person? Is this person competitive with us? But prior salary can be influenced by a lot of factors that may not necessarily be appropriate to take into consideration in the final decision of a candidate. So yeah, there are some employers who use that information, but I'll share with you, here in the United States, there are a number of jurisdictions that are actually outlawing that question in interviewing processes, because that question tends to become a discriminatory question for people who might have had lower paying jobs in the past to be ruled out.
Yeah. So, okay, let's move along here. How long should a resume, and especially how long should a resume be, especially in instances when you have worked at several companies over the years?
Well, you're now asking us questions that are gearing us into an entirely different topic than what we wanted to do for today. But let me just give you some quick thoughts about that. I would use the following definitions. A resume should be short and concise. Most readers of resumes don't want to spend time reading pages and pages and pages. There are some organizational environments where a single page resume is the norm, and there are other organizational environments where a single page resume is seen as too weak and too light, and therefore not very positive. So I think it's important to understand the kinds of organizations that you might be looking at and what might be some of the normative things in those environments. But still in all, short and concise needs to be the underlying message. It's not to see how much you can write, but to see what you can write that's going to be of value to the reader. You're trying to fit yourself to the opportunity.
Right. We just got one more follow-up question on the interviews, which is, if you are asked about, at the interview question, what about your past salary amount, what would be a tactical way to handle that question?
Well, I think the response to that question is going to largely depend as you look at your previous salaries compared to your research of the salaries that might exist for this position that you're applying to. An example, if you're applying for a position at the IDB, or for that matter, any international organization, they usually cite salaries net of taxes, meaning that it is an amount of money that's less than what you would receive in the private sector for the same job, because in the private sector, they are paying you more money because you have to pay taxes on your salary. So that's one distinction that exists right there. If you are, let's say, moving from one country to another, that has obviously different denominations of cash, you may want to make a conversion of your salary, current salary, into something that's meaningful to the country where you're applying into. So that would make better sense or greater sense to them. So you want to be responding in ways that are going to make sense, that are going to be supportive to you, that are going to be helpful to you.
Right. Moving on, is there an internal referral process at the IDB as there are in private companies like Google, Amazon, banks, or law firms?
Thelma, I'll turn that to you.
Sorry, an issue with my mute. Internal referral. Basically, we don't have anything formalized. I would have to say it's more ad hoc. However, we do work with referrals, and they're pretty much based on people that are currently working in the organization that might have worked with other people or might know through their business network, might know others. And it's usually not based on personal relations. It's more based on business experience and, you know, where people have worked and the type of exposure they've had, obviously based on the particular business need that we have. So we do have an internal process, but I would have to say it is, it's more ad hoc. And it has given us some really great candidates and people who are now working in the institution, I would have to say.
Right. So Sasha also gave a comment earlier on, and I don't know how Eric would want to comment on this. We were referring to the length of time you want that your job search would equate to based on the salary expectation. Do you expect that, given this particular environment of COVID and the mass job losses that we have, that the job search time may actually double now?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball that can help out on that. I am aware, at least in this country, that yes, although millions of people lost jobs due to the coronavirus and the shutdown of the economy, at the same time, there were organizations that were largely expanding their workforce, organizations that were part of response to the coronavirus in one way or another. So this has in fact been the case, as I've experienced over my 40 plus years in the business, that even in times of recessions, prior even to this, when there have been downturns in the economy and therefore downturns in employment and rise of unemployment, at those same times, there have been organizations that have been growing and expanding. So I just think I offer that idea in terms of giving yourself time to recognize that this is not like a water faucet that you can just turn on and automatically you're going to have a job offer the next day. I think you want to give yourself sufficient time to plan and engage in the job search process to ultimately give you, positive solution. I'll use myself as an example, just to offer in two circumstances in my past life when I was leaving two different jobs. In one case, I had given my notice and I had my next job in line in hand even before my last day of employment at the previous job. In another circumstance, when I decided to leave an organization, it took me 11 months to find the next position. Luckily for me, I was able to do some day-to-day consulting within that organization that kept me gainfully employed, but I was no longer in the same role and responsibility that I previously had. So between almost zero time and 11 months, there is a range there. So I just offer that as a personal stories to help people understand.
And just to add to what Eric was saying, we're actually an organization that is hiring. We're currently hiring because we're counter-cyclical. So in IDB Invest, for example, the private sector branch, we're actually growing in terms of not only clients, but in terms of the financing. We're growing from 3.5 billion to 7 billion. So we're actually looking for people as we speak. So I agree with you, Eric, that there might be some organizations, some companies that might be looking at not necessarily hiring or having to let some people go, but then you have others that are actually finding opportunities throughout this, what is a time of hardship for many.
Right. And following from that as well, Stacy gave us a comment, and I'm not sure if you want to comment on it or not. Here in TNT, employers often take advantage of the fact that job seekers are desperate, quotes in quotation marks, and they look for highly qualified candidates for the least amount of money. This makes many of the principles enshrined here difficult to adhere to. Any comments?
Reminder, we lost you at the second part of that.
Sorry. Here, employers often take advantage of the fact that job seekers are desperate, quote unquote, and look for highly qualified candidates for the least amount of money. This makes many of the principles enshrined in this lesson very difficult to adhere to. I suppose it's more of a personal comment. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that.
I can answer, at least from what I know. So we work with an internal firm, sorry, not an internal firm, an external firm that is well reputed internationally, that does salary surveys literally globally for both expatriate as well as national staff positions. And based on that, we develop salary scales. So the idea is to be able to be competitive in the market. We compare ourselves to certain other organizations that are working with people. Basically, it's a similar market. Based on that is that we develop, once again, our salary compensation structures. I find it hard to believe that we will try to find the best candidates for the least amount of money based on what I have offered. And we also take into consideration internal equity issues. So that's my general answer, at least based on my experience at the IDB.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's important. Yes, certainly there are employers who are trying to get the most for the least. But smart employers know that they want to get the best for the appropriate. and they want people to be happy when they join in. They don't want people to come on board already with a kind of a chip on their shoulder. I'm angry with the salary that you're offering to me, and I'm going to be starting to look for another job right away. You know, that's not helpful to the employer. So employers are largely trying to find people who are going to be happy, and they're trying to make them happy on the job. Most.
Great. Great. I have one more question, and I think, Eric, you touched on it a little bit yesterday. One of the attendees asked, if we need a job immediately due to the financial pressures tied to this pandemic, do you have any suggestions? And what about part-time work? Because I know yesterday we touched a little bit on the gig economy as well.
Correct. So I think, and let me connect that also with what we spoke about last week, which is about needs. And when I mentioned to you that needs assessment exercise, I thought I encouraged people to actually put the date on it when they're completing that, because needs change due to external circumstances. And if you are an individual right now who says, I need a job because I have monthly rent to pay at the end of the month and I have food to put on the table for myself and or my family, then my encouragement is you want to look for a job. You want to look for something that's going to be able to meet those needs as efficiently as possible. That a job is probably going to be different from the job. But at this moment, that priority tends to be that need. And so I think it's to understand that, not to be embarrassed by that, not to say I'm putting myself as a second fiddle. That's what I'm responding to right now, is what is my need currently to do? And that need is perhaps and hopefully going to change over time. So whether it's part-time opportunity, gig economy, temporary employment, all those kinds of things are considerations. And by the way, there are, as I mentioned earlier in the session yesterday and last week, there are employers who use those individuals of temporary employment or part-time employment or gig as, if you will, reviews and opportunities to take a look at what the marketplace is and are there some good people out there. And I have known many individuals who've been hired for regular positions who started as a volunteer, who started as a part-timer, who was an outside consultant or gig economy person, and then came inside for that. So I hope that answers, but that is a difficult circumstance that people might find themselves in right now, and I hope that we can help you with that. I need to share with you, Renato, I'm not going to be able to spend too much more time online, and I have other responsibilities to
Yes,
return to.
I think that was actually the last question. Thank you so very much. We've already run those 20 minutes over. Thank you so very much, Eric and Thelma, for all the contributions that you have given us today. Do either of you have any final comments, words of advice, anything?
Thelma, anything to add?
No, just thank you all for accompanying us today, and more than happy to answer any additional questions you might have offline.
And I would just end by wishing everyone best of luck and best wishes in their job search campaign. And look at this as the opportunity to present yourself and to seek better opportunities or newer opportunities for yourself and all that that entails. So best wishes.
Great. Thank you guys so very much. Eric, you've given us a lot to think about. Thelma, thank you so very much for giving us all your contributions. To all the participants, remember that you can access vacancies at the IADB via their job portal and their website. If you have any further questions that you would like us to forward to the speakers or to forward to the recruitment at the IADB, please forward it to alumni@lockjackgsb.edu.tt, which is our alumni communications, and we'll be happy to forward it along to the representatives at the IADB. I'd like to remind everyone that as Career Month proceeds, next week, Wednesday and Thursday, we will also be having webinars. Next week, we will be actually hosted by the IFC, the International Financial Corporation, Mr. Rudy Moreno, as well as Ellen Mashiri, and they will be talking about international recruitment, and that's going to be happening on next Wednesday. And on Thursday, the IDB joins us again. Ria will be joined with Patricia Arrhenius, who will be talking about the GROW model, learning through experience. So we look forward to seeing everyone again next week. And thank you very much for all the contributions and all the questions. It was a very lively session and very, very productive. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing everyone again next Wednesday at noon for international recruitment from the IFC. Have a good day, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday. Thanks again, Eric and Thelma.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.